Imagine standing in the scorching afternoon sun of rural Texas, watching a man deliberately throw himself from a galloping horse onto the horns of a charging animal weighing nearly a ton. Now imagine you're a German soldier, trained in the precise tactics of the Wehrmacht, taught that every action serves a strategic military purpose, and you've just been told this violent spectacle is recreational entertainment. Your mind would reject it completely. That's exactly what happened in the summer of 1943, when hundreds of captured German soldiers witnessed something so fundamentally alien to their understanding of civilization that they invented an entirely new interpretation rather than accept the truth. What they saw that day would challenge everything they believed about their enemy, about warfare, and about what it meant to be free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The freight cars rattled through the endless Texas prairie on a blistering July afternoon in 1943, carrying their cargo of defeated men toward an uncertain fate. Inside those sweltering metal boxes, 470 German prisoners sat in uncomfortable silence, their uniforms still bearing the dust of North African battlefields, where Rommel's once invincible Afrika Korps had finally crumbled under Allied pressure. They were tankers from the 15th Panzer Division, infantrymen from the 90th Light Division, Luftwaffe ground crew whose airfields had been overrun, all now bound for a place called Camp Breckenridge in the small Texas municipality of Caldwell, population 9,312 souls, who were about to host more Germans than had ever set foot in Central Texas. Hauptmann Dieter Kraus pressed his face against the small barred window, watching the landscape scroll past in waves of golden grassland and scattered oak trees. At 31 years old, he'd commanded a panzer company through 2 years of desert warfare, earning an Iron Cross and a reputation for tactical brilliance. Now he commanded nothing but his own gnawing uncertainty about what awaited them. The rumors had circulated during their Atlantic crossing aboard a converted Liberty ship. American camps were either death factories worse than anything the Soviets operated, or they were elaborate traps designed to extract intelligence through psychological torture masked as comfort. Nobody knew which version to believe. The train lurched to a halt at a rural depot where a hand-painted sign read "Caldwell, Gateway to the Brazos Valley." Armed American soldiers, their uniforms crisp despite the oppressive heat, formed neat lines along the platform. A major with a sunburned face and a clipboard began calling out names in badly accented German. The prisoners filed out, blinking in the harsh sunlight, taking in their surroundings with the trained observational skills of military men. What they saw confused them immediately. The guards seemed almost relaxed, rifles held casually rather than at the ready. One American soldier was actually smiling, chatting with a fellow guard about something mundane. There were no dogs, no obvious instruments of interrogation, no hard-faced Gestapo equivalents waiting to begin the work of breaking them. Instead, they saw a cluster of whitewashed buildings arranged in orderly rows behind double fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers at each corner manned by soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave. Behind the camp, the town itself sprawled modestly, church steeples rising above tree lines, ordinary houses with ordinary lives continuing as if a small army of enemy combatants hadn't just arrived on their doorstep. Camp Breckenridge sprawled across 320 acres of former ranch land that the War Department had appropriated in early 1942. By the time Kraus and his men arrived, it had evolved into one of the more substantial prisoner facilities in the Southwest, designed to hold up the 4,000 German and Italian POWs who would provide desperately needed agricultural labor to a region stripped of its young men by the draft. The camp infrastructure reflected this utilitarian purpose. 80 barracks buildings arranged in neat geometric precision, each housing 50 men in double-decker bunks. A central mess facility that could feed 1,000 prisoners per sitting. A hospital staffed by captured German medical officers and American supervisors. A recreation hall, a chapel, even a small theater where prisoners would eventually stage elaborate productions of Goethe and Schiller. The first meal shocked them more than the journey itself. Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, a veteran of the French and Russian campaigns before his transfer to Africa, stared at his dinner tray as if it might explode. Real beef, not the mysterious meat products they'd survived on during the final months in Tunisia. Potatoes with actual butter, bread that wasn't mixed with sawdust, fresh carrots and green beans. Coffee, genuine coffee, not the roasted acorn substitute that had become standard in the Wehrmacht. He caught the eye of his closest friend, Corporal Erich Zimmermann, and saw his own disbelief reflected back. "This is the deception," Hoffmann muttered quietly in German. "They fatten us before the slaughter, like livestock. Make us comfortable so we lower our defenses. Then the real interrogations begin." Zimmermann, who'd been a philosophy student at Heidelberg before the war interrupted his education, wasn't so certain. He'd been reading the Geneva Convention rules posted in German on the barracks walls, studying the careful, bureaucratic language about humane treatment, adequate nutrition, and protection from abuse. The Americans seemed to be following these guidelines with an almost legalistic precision that felt distinctly unsinister. The first 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo of adjustment. Morning roll call at 6 sharp, followed by breakfast, then work assignments for enlisted men while officers remained in camp per Geneva Convention exemptions. The enlisted prisoners boarded trucks each morning, heading to surrounding cotton plantations and vegetable farms where they labored alongside Mexican braceros and elderly American farmers whose sons had gone to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The work was hard, the Texas heat brutal, but the treatment remained puzzlingly fair. They received 80 cents per day in camp scrip, money they could spend at a canteen stocked with cigarettes, candy bars, writing paper, even musical instruments. Officers like Krauss faced a different challenge, the crushing boredom of captivity without purpose. They organized classes to maintain mental discipline. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, a former gymnasium teacher, taught English lessons using donated textbooks. Oberleutnant Stefan Braun, who'd studied engineering in Berlin, led mathematics courses. Others taught history, literature, even music theory. A small contingent of ardent Nazis tried to maintain ideological discipline, holding secretive meetings where they discussed the inevitable German victory and planned what they'd do to collaborators when the Reich reclaimed its rightful dominance. But most prisoners simply tried to survive psychologically, writing carefully censored letters home, reading worn books from the camp library, and waiting for a war to end one way or another. The announcement came on a Saturday morning, the last day of July. Camp Commandant Colonel Harrison, a career officer from San Antonio with a surprisingly decent command of German, gathered the prisoners in the recreation yard. He explained that, as a gesture of cultural exchange and good faith, selected prisoners with exemplary behavior records would be permitted to attend a local community event that evening. Transportation would be provided. Guards would maintain security, but the outing represented an opportunity to observe authentic American civilian life. Krauss immediately suspected a trap. Why would captors expose prisoners to civilian populations? It made no tactical sense unless the Americans planned to use them for propaganda purposes, perhaps parading defeated enemies before crowds to boost home front morale. Yet Colonel Harrison's demeanor suggested nothing sinister. He seemed almost enthusiastic, like a host eager to share something he genuinely enjoyed with unexpected guests. 75 prisoners volunteered, a mix of officers and senior NCOs, including Krauss, Hoffmann, Zimmermann, and Weber. That evening, as the summer sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they climbed aboard 3 military trucks under the watchful but not particularly aggressive supervision of a dozen American guards. The convoy rolled through Caldwell's modest downtown, past the county courthouse, the First Baptist Church, small shops with hand-painted signs advertising everything from feed supplies to ladies' dresses. Children played in yards. Old men sat on porches, fanning themselves in the lingering heat. It looked nothing like the America that Goebbels' propaganda machine had described. No urban decay, no racial violence in the streets, no visible signs of the mongrel democracy collapsing under its own contradictions. The trucks turned onto a dirt road leading to the edge of town, pulling up to a large open area where hundreds of civilians had gathered around a massive fenced arena constructed from weathered wooden planks. Livestock pens filled with horses and cattle lined one side of the grounds. Men wearing enormous hats and leather chaps gathered near a series of wooden chutes and gates, stretching, smoking, laughing with the easy camaraderie of people who knew each other well. A concession stand sold popcorn and cold drinks. Families spread blankets on the ground or claimed spots on rough-hewn bleachers. A banner stretched across the announcer's booth proclaimed Caldwell County Championship Rodeo, Summer 1943. The German prisoners filed into a roped-off section with benches, their guards settling nearby but paying more attention to the arena than to their charges. The atmosphere felt festive, communal, completely divorced from anything military. Kraus scanned the crowd, his tactical mind automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes, but finding only civilians engaged in what appeared to be genuine leisure. Whatever this event was, it clearly held significance for these Texans. A man in an embroidered Western shirt climbed into the announcer's booth, his voice booming through a crackling loudspeaker system. He welcomed everyone to the evening's competition, thanked sponsors, made jokes that drew laughter from the crowd, and then announced the first event. Bareback bronc riding. 8 seconds to glory, folks. Our first rider tonight is Jimmy Ray Collins from right here in Caldwell, sitting on a horse called Dynamite who hasn't been rode clean in 17 tries. A gate swung open with a metallic clang, and chaos erupted into the arena. A brown and white horse exploded from the chute with a young man clinging to its back, one hand gripping a leather rigging, the other waving wildly in the air for balance. The horse bucked straight up, came down with all 4 hooves locked, then twisted its body in a violent corkscrew motion that seemed to defy basic physics. The rider's head snapped back and forth like a broken doll, his legs flailing, his face contorted with effort. The crowd roared its approval. Kraus leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Beside him, Hoffman watched with equal intensity. The rider managed to stay mounted for perhaps 5 seconds before the horse executed a particularly vicious twist that sent him flying through the air. He hit the dirt hard, rolled, and scrambled to his feet as 2 men on horseback swooped in to herd the still bucking bronco toward an exit gate. The thrown rider limped away, retrieving his hat from the dust, waving to acknowledge the crowd's sympathetic applause. Weber, the former teacher, turned to Kraus with a perplexed expression. What manner of cavalry training is this? The horse appears specifically chosen for its inability to be ridden. What tactical advantage does this develop? Kraus didn't answer immediately, studying the arena as the next rider prepared. Perhaps it's conditioning, he finally said. Training soldiers to maintain composure during equipment failure. If a cavalryman's mount panics under artillery fire, he must stay seated and regain control. This could be simulation training, using naturally aggressive horses to replicate combat stress without actual danger from enemy fire. The explanation satisfied the men around him. It made perfect sense through their lens of military logic. Every exercise had a purpose. Every challenge developed a specific skill. The Americans must have adapted their cavalry conditioning for public viewing, probably to maintain civilian morale by demonstrating military readiness. The fact that the riders wore civilian clothes rather than uniforms simply meant this was reserve training, part-time soldiers maintaining readiness while holding civilian jobs. The next event deepened their conviction. Calf roping, the announcer called it. A cowboy on horseback exploded from a box as a young calf sprinted into the arena. The rider's lasso spun overhead in perfect circles before releasing with practiced precision. The loop dropped over the calf's head, the horse planted its hooves and slid to a stop, and the cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion. He sprinted to the calf, threw it onto its side with practiced leverage, and tied 3 of its legs together with a smaller rope in just under 9 seconds. The crowd erupted. Zimmerman pulled a small notebook from his pocket, sketching quick diagrams. "Recognition and capture techniques," he murmured. "Notice the coordination between rider and mount. The horse maintains rope tension automatically, freeing the operative to execute the ground phase. This is sophisticated training for behind-the-lines operations." Around them, other prisoners nodded in agreement. They were watching what they believed to be a brilliant adaptation of military training for public consumption. The Americans were maintaining combat readiness through competitive exercises disguised as entertainment, keeping their population engaged while developing genuine tactical skills. It was actually quite clever, they agreed, more efficient than the rigid drilling that characterized Wehrmacht training, and it built public support simultaneously. The bull riding commenced as darkness fell and temporary floodlights illuminated the arena with harsh white light. The announcer's voice took on a more dramatic tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness the most dangerous 8 seconds in sports. Our first bull tonight is Satan's Shadow, 1,800 pounds of pure mean." The chute gate crashed open and a massive black bull erupted into the light with a rider perched precariously on its back. The animal spun, kicked, and twisted with such violence that several German prisoners actually gasped. This wasn't the controlled aggression of the horses. This was genuine fury, an animal determined to destroy whatever clung to its back. The rider lasted perhaps 4 seconds before being launched skyward, landing in a heap while 2 rodeo clowns in baggy pants and face paint rushed to distract the bull, allowing the fallen cowboy to scramble to safety. Hoffman watched the clowns with particular fascination. "Diversion tactics," he announced to his companions. "Those men in costume are trained to draw enemy attention away from vulnerable personnel." Military deception units use similar techniques. Disguise the tactical purpose with absurd appearance. Exploit the enemy's psychological response to chaos. The Germans spent the next 2 hours constructing an elaborate military framework around everything they witnessed. The barrel racing, young women on horseback racing in cloverleaf patterns around 3 barrels, became reconnaissance training for rapid directional changes. The team roping, 2 cowboys working in coordination to capture a running steer, was obviously small unit tactics development. The steer wrestling, where a rider leaped from his horse to tackle a running animal using only strength and technique, was clearly hand-to-hand combat conditioning. Every event found its place in their interpretive framework. The injuries they witnessed, a cowboy limping away with a clearly damaged ankle, another being helped from the arena with blood streaming from a split lip, only confirmed their assumptions. Real training involved real risk. The Americans were serious about maintaining military effectiveness even if they dressed it up as public entertainment. As the evening concluded and the prisoners loaded back onto trucks for the return to camp, their conversations buzzed with newfound respect for American military preparation. These Texans weren't the soft, undisciplined enemies that German propaganda had described. They were maintaining combat readiness through a decentralized system that embedded training into civilian culture. It was innovative, perhaps even superior to traditional military methods in some ways. Back at Camp Breckenridge, Krauss lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's observations. Something nagged at him, some detail that didn't quite fit the military training narrative, but he couldn't identify what troubled him. The skill level had been impressive, the danger genuine, the public enthusiasm overwhelming. Yet something felt wrong about his interpretation, some fundamental misunderstanding he couldn't articulate. In another barracks, Zimmerman wrote in his journal by the dim light of a single bulb. "Tonight we observed American cavalry training disguised as public entertainment. The techniques demonstrated genuine tactical value, though the delivery system remains puzzling. Why invite enemy prisoners to observe military training? Unless they believe we'll never return to combat, that the war's outcome is already decided. This possibility disturbs me more than the captivity itself." Neither man could have guessed that their fundamental misunderstanding of what they'd witnessed would, in time, teach them more about America than any propaganda briefing or intelligence report ever could. But that realization would come slowly, through accumulated evidence and reluctant acceptance that the world operated on principles they'd never been taught to recognize. The rodeo had planted seeds of cognitive dissonance that would eventually bloom into something like understanding. But for now, in the summer of 1943, they remained convinced they'd witnessed military training. And in their minds, that made the Americans far more formidable than they'd previously believed. The following weeks brought an unexpected shift in camp dynamics. Word of the rodeo spread through the barracks like wildfire, with those who'd attended describing what they'd witnessed to envious listeners who'd missed the opportunity. The interpretations grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some prisoners began theorizing that the entire event was part of a sophisticated American psychological warfare program designed to intimidate captured enemies by demonstrating that even their civilians trained for combat as recreation. Others suggested it represented a fundamental difference in American military philosophy, one that emphasized individual initiative over collective discipline. Lieutenant Weber started teaching a new class he called American Military Culture and Tactics, using the rodeo as his primary case study. He filled a chalkboard with diagrams showing how each event translated to battlefield applications. The bull riding developed mental fortitude under extreme stress. The roping events trained rapid target acquisition and restraint techniques. The bronc riding prepared cavalry for mount failures during combat. His students, mostly younger prisoners still idealistic about military science, took dutiful notes and debated the finer points of American training methodology. But Zimmerman's doubts had begun to crystallize into something more substantial. He spent his free time in the camp library, searching through donated books and magazines for information about rodeos. What he discovered challenged everything they'd assumed. The books described rodeo as entertainment, as sport, as a celebration of Western heritage. They mentioned prize money, championship titles, traveling circuits of professional competitors. Nothing in the literature suggested military connections. He brought his findings to Krause one evening as they walked the perimeter during their allotted recreation time. The captain listened in silence as Zimmerman outlined his research, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "If this is truly civilian entertainment with no military purpose," Krause said slowly, "then we've fundamentally misunderstood something essential about these people. But how can that be? What kind of civilization treats deliberate danger as amusement? What kind of men risk permanent injury for small cash prizes and trinkets?" Zimmerman had no answer. The concept violated every principle of their upbringing. In Germany, physical risk was justified only through collective necessity. You face danger for the fatherland, for your unit, for strategic objectives. The idea of choosing danger for personal satisfaction, for the pure challenge of it, existed outside their philosophical framework entirely. The second rodeo invitation arrived in mid-September. This time, over 200 prisoners requested permission to attend. The camp administration, pleased that their cultural exchange program seemed successful, arranged for additional transportation and expanded seating. What the Americans didn't realize was that the German officers were treating this as a reconnaissance mission, an opportunity to study what they now suspected might be something far stranger than military training. Krause attended again, but this time with a different mindset. Instead of watching the events themselves, he studied the crowd. He observed families with small children sitting in the stands, eating popcorn while watching men get thrown from animals. He noticed teenage couples on dates, holding hands while bulls spun violently in the arena below. He saw elderly women keeping score on printed programs, clapping politely when riders succeeded and gasping sympathetically when they failed. This was not a military audience evaluating tactical efficiency. This was a community gathered for entertainment, treating serious injury risk the same way Germans might treat a football match or boxing exhibition. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. During the intermission, an American guard named Corporal Daniel Martinez approached their section, carrying cups of lemonade he'd purchased from the concession stand. Martinez was a second-generation Mexican-American from El Paso, fluent in Spanish and conversational in German, which he'd studied in high school. He'd developed a friendly rapport with several prisoners over the past months, often chatting during work details about mundane topics like weather, food, and hometown memories. "You fellas enjoying the show?" Martinez asked, distributing the lemonade with casual generosity that still startled the Germans after months of experiencing it. Hoffman accepted a cup and asked the question that had been burning in all their minds. "Corporal Martinez, these cowboys we're watching, are they military reservists, part-time soldiers maintaining combat readiness?" Martinez laughed, a genuine sound of surprised amusement. "Military? Hell no, begging your pardon. That's Tommy Wilkins from the hardware store, been riding bulls since he was 16. That tall fella who just roped the calf, he's a high school history teacher. The lady who won the barrel racing earlier, she runs a beauty parlor in town. These folks do this for fun on weekends and holidays. Some of the real good ones travel around competing for prize money, but mostly they got regular jobs." The silence that followed was profound. Zimmerman found his voice first. "They do this voluntarily? For entertainment? Not for military preparation or strategic training?" Martinez looked genuinely confused by the question. "Strategic training? It's rodeo, boys. It's cowboy tradition going back to the old trail drives. The lady who won the barrel racing earlier, she runs a beauty parlor in town. These folks do this for fun on weekends and holidays. Some of the real good ones travel around competing for prize money, but mostly they got regular jobs." The silence that followed was profound. Zimmerman found his voice first. "They do this voluntarily? For entertainment? Not for military preparation or strategic training?" Martinez looked genuinely confused by the question. "Strategic training? It's rodeo, boys. It's cowboy tradition going back to the old trail drives." Ranch hands used to compete during downtime to see who had the best skills. Turned into organized sport maybe 50, 60 years ago. Dangerous as hell? Sure, but that's part of the appeal. Takes guts to climb on a bull, you know? "But why?" Weber asked, his teacher's analytical mind struggling to process this information. "What purpose does it serve if not military or practical necessity?" Martinez considered the question seriously. "I guess because it's a challenge, because it connects folks to their heritage, because doing something difficult and dangerous makes you feel alive, because it's exciting to watch, because cowboys have been doing it so long, it's part of who we are out here." He shrugged. "Not everything needs a practical purpose, does it? Sometimes things are worthwhile just because they matter to people." After Martinez moved on to chat with other guards, the German prisoners sat in stunned contemplation. The second half of the rodeo passed in a blur. They watched the same events with completely different eyes now, seeing not military tactics, but individual human beings making personal choices to risk themselves for reasons that defied everything they'd been taught about proper social organization. A cowboy named Ray Sanderson drew a bull called Tornado, an animal the announcer described with obvious relish as having thrown 49 consecutive riders. Sanderson was a wiry man in his early 30s, and when he climbed onto the bull in the bucking chute, his face showed not fear, but intense concentration mixed with something that looked almost like joy. The gate opened. Tornado spun left, then immediately reversed right, a move that caught Sanderson off guard. He flew off after barely 3 seconds, landing hard on his shoulder. Medical staff rushed over, but Sanderson waved them away, stood up slowly, and walked out of the arena to scattered applause. Krauss watched this man, this hardware store clerk or farmhand or whatever he was, risk serious injury for a chance at 8 seconds of glory and a modest cash prize that probably didn't even cover his entry fees. There was no commanding officer ordering him into danger, no strategic objective being served, no collective benefit to justify the individual risk. Just a man and a bull and a personal choice to test himself against a challenge that didn't need to exist. Something fundamental shifted in Krauss's understanding that evening, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what. He'd spent his entire adult life in a system that subordinated individual desire to collective purpose. The state determined your education, your career, your acceptable opinions. The military refined this even further, creating a world where personal choice existed only in the smallest interstices of regimented life. And here were these Americans choosing danger, choosing challenge, choosing to test themselves against arbitrary difficulties for no better reason than because they wanted to. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. How could a nation of such undisciplined individualists have defeated the Panzer Corps in Tunisia? How could people who treated serious danger as weekend entertainment have built the industrial capacity currently churning out tanks, planes, and ships faster than Germany could destroy them? The contradiction refused to resolve itself. Back at Camp Breckinridge that night, the discussions in the barracks took on a different character. Some prisoners clung to their military training theories, unable or unwilling to accept Martinez's explanation. These men insisted that the corporal had been lying, that the whole performance was still somehow connected to military preparation, just hidden beneath layers of civilian cover story. They needed it to be military training because the alternative implied something about American society that threatened their entire worldview. But others, particularly the older prisoners who'd seen enough of war to question the ideologies that had led them into it, began cautiously exploring the implications of what they'd learned. If Americans truly embraced voluntary danger for personal satisfaction, if they truly valued individual choice over collective discipline, if they truly organized their society around personal freedom rather than state direction, then perhaps everything German propaganda had said about American weakness was backwards. Perhaps the chaos wasn't weakness, but a different kind of strength. Perhaps the lack of rigid discipline reflected confidence rather than decay. Perhaps a nation of people who chose their own challenges couldn't be broken the way a nation of people following orders could be, because Americans fought for something internal and personal rather than external and imposed. Zimmerman wrote extensively in his journal that night, working through the philosophical implications by candlelight after lights out. If individual men risk injury for personal glory without state sanction or collective benefit, then individual agency holds genuine value in American society. This contradicts everything we've been taught about the necessity of subordinating self to state. But if their system functions despite, or perhaps because of, this individualism, then perhaps the collective emphasis we've accepted as natural law is merely one option among many. This possibility is either liberation or chaos, and I cannot yet determine which. The autumn months brought routine. Work details continued, with prisoners harvesting cotton and vegetables as the growing season wound down. The camp library expanded with new donations. The theater group staged an ambitious production of Faust that drew enthusiastic attendance from both prisoners and curious American officers. Mail from Germany arrived sporadically, letters that had taken months to transit multiple censorship checkpoints, carrying news that grew steadily grimmer. Allied bombing campaigns were devastating German cities. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder consuming entire divisions. The confident talk of inevitable German victory had faded into bitter defensive fighting. Some prisoners began to recognize that they'd survived this war only because they'd been captured, only because they sat safely in Texas while their former comrades died in places like Stalingrad and Kursk. The guilt was overwhelming for some, driving them into depression or desperate denial. Others rationalized their survival as luck or fate. A few began, very quietly, to wonder if being captured had saved them not just from death, but from something worse, from continued participation in a cause that was revealing itself to be fundamentally wrong. The third rodeo came in November, a smaller affair marking the end of the season. Only about 30 prisoners attended this time, mostly those who'd become genuinely curious about this peculiar American cultural practice. Krauss went again, and this time he spoke at length with several cowboys during a break between events. One rider, a man named Charlie Hernandez who worked at a cotton gin in a neighboring town, explained his attraction to bull riding with surprising eloquence. "It's about testing yourself," he said, leaning against a fence rail and rolling a cigarette. "Knowing that animal wants you off, and you're gonna try to stay on anyway. It's pure. There's no politics, no bullshit, excuse my language. Just you and the bull and 8 seconds. If you make it, you proved something to yourself. If you don't, well, you tried, and that counts for something too." "But the danger," Krauss pressed. "You could be killed, paralyzed, seriously maimed. For what? $80 and a belt buckle?" Hernandez shrugged. "My daddy worked in that cotton gin for 40 years and died with nothing to show for it but a pension and a bad back. I work there too, and I'll probably die the same way. But every weekend I ride, I'm alive in a way that work don't make me feel. It's mine, you know? My choice, my risk, my victory if I win, my failure if I lose. Ain't nobody ordering me to do it. Ain't nobody can take it away from me." That explanation, more than any academic analysis or philosophical treatise, finally broke through Krauss's ideological conditioning. Hernandez had articulated something essential about American culture: the fierce protection of personal autonomy, the belief that individual choice held intrinsic value regardless of outcome, the conviction that a free person's voluntary risks mattered more than a controlled person's imposed safety. Germany had built its society on different principles. The individual existed to serve the collective, to advance the race, to strengthen the state. Personal desires were selfish unless they aligned with approved objectives. Risk was justified only through strategic necessity. The idea that a man might choose danger simply because it made him feel alive, simply because it was his choice to make, was treated as either childish or dangerous. But here was Charlie Hernandez, working class, probably not highly educated, living in a small Texas town, articulating a philosophy of individual sovereignty that made Germany's totalitarian certainties suddenly seem not strong but fragile, not sophisticated but crude, not inevitable but merely one option, and perhaps not even a good one. The war ground on through 1944 and into 1945. News from Europe grew catastrophic from the German perspective. The Western Allies landed in Normandy. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward. Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble. At Camp Breckinridge, prisoners listened to sanitized news broadcasts and read censored letters from home, watching their nation collapse from 6,000 miles away while they picked cotton under the Texas sun and ate better food than their families back home could scrounge from ruined stores. Victory in Europe was finally announced in May 1945. The war was over. Germany had lost. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12, ending in utter defeat and moral catastrophe. As more information emerged about concentration camps and the systematic murder of millions, some prisoners retreated into denial while others faced crushing shame. But they didn't go home immediately. The Geneva Convention allowed detaining prisoners until formal peace treaties were signed, and nobody was eager to return thousands of former Wehrmacht soldiers to a Germany that lay in ruins, divided between Soviet and Western occupation zones, struggling with starvation and political chaos. So the prisoners remained at Camp Breckinridge through the summer and autumn of 1945, their status shifting from enemy combatants to something more ambiguous: men in limbo, waiting for a future that remained unclear. During those strange months of post-war captivity, several prisoners attended one final rodeo, a special event organized to celebrate the end of the war. They sat in the stands not as enemies, but as something closer to guests, watching cowboys ride bulls and rope steers under the same floodlights that had confused them so profoundly 2 years earlier. But this time they understood what they were seeing. They recognized it not as military training, but as something potentially more significant, a cultural practice that embodied values utterly foreign to their upbringing, yet increasingly appealing in retrospect. Krauss sat next to Zimmerman in the stands, watching a young cowboy successfully ride a vicious bull for the full 8 seconds, dismounting to thunderous applause and a check for $150. 2 years ago, we thought this was cavalry training, Krauss said quietly. We couldn't imagine that free men would choose this danger voluntarily. And now? Zimmerman asked. Now, I think perhaps we lost the war because we couldn't imagine it. Because we were taught that freedom meant chaos and discipline meant strength. But these Americans built their strength from freedom, from millions of individual choices to do difficult things for no better reason than because they wanted to. You can't defeat that with orders and ideology. You can only defeat it by killing every single person, and even then, I'm not sure you'd succeed. The prisoners finally began shipping out in late 1945 and early 1946, loaded onto trains heading to ports on the Gulf Coast, then onto transport ships sailing back across the Atlantic to a homeland most of them barely recognized. Germany was divided, starving, occupied by foreign armies, its cities reduced to rubble, and its people facing a reckoning with horrors that would take generations to process. Most former prisoners never returned to Texas, couldn't afford to even if they'd wanted to, and had no desire to revisit the place of their captivity. But a handful maintained correspondence with American families they'd met during work details or through church programs. A very few eventually immigrated once restrictions eased in the 1950s, settling in Texas and building new lives in the place that had once imprisoned them. Dieter Krauss returned to Germany in February 1946, found his hometown in the Soviet occupation zone, discovered his wife and daughter had died in a bombing raid in 1944, and slipped across the border into the American zone within 6 months. He worked odd jobs for several years before managing to immigrate to the United States in 1952, settling in Austin, where he worked as a mechanic and occasionally attended rodeos, always remembering that summer evening in 1943 when he'd first witnessed something his training had never prepared him to understand: free people choosing their own risks for their own reasons. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.